Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Primates in Space. Primates Discover Agriculture. Now, this is a controversial one because there's an entire world of thinking that says that agriculture is kind of the worst invention that ever happened, and it destroyed, the easy living of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and all these kinds of ideas. And I don't know, perhaps, but it did happen, and we are the inheritors of the traditions of the agricultural revolution, and it was a revolution indeed. And so I think it's important to reflect on what happened, why it's important, which I think is often, there's many reasons it's important, but some of the reasons that why it's important, I think, are overlooked relative to our primate ancestors and how it was possible that these primates that lived in small groups were able to have a revolution of the agricultural variety, which led to the ability to live in, and was a feedback loop to live in much larger societies over longer time scales, et cetera, and getting really the foundation of much of the modern world comes directly from this change. And so what that change was and what it says about us and how it speaks to the condition in which we find ourselves today is, I think, crucial to understand, and I think it's an often overlooked element because we talk about the Industrial Revolution and then we talk about the technological revolution, which is all well and good, but it's important to remember that those are built on and made possible by the agricultural revolution, which is ongoing, right? If agriculture stopped tomorrow, this would be ungood, but it would unweave the fabric of our contemporary civilization because it is founded on that and that tradition. And something else would have to come along to replace it, I'm sure, but probably not anything like what we have today. And so it is foundational. And that revolution itself was built on, again, the kind of native capacities that were innate in our primate ancestors, just amplified, reinforced, selected for, and kaboom, off we go running in the agricultural revolution. So a couple of notes here, some dates and such. Again, this is very not controversial. It's, exactly when these things happened is not really so important as the fact that it did happen. But roughly speaking, you're looking at the general dates about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, in India, in China. You get this beginning of the wide-scale cultivation of the main cereal crops. And in Eurasia and Europe, these are wheat, rice, and millet primarily. In the New World, the civilizations that are built on this is basically on maize or corn, potatoes, quinoa, and beans to a certain extent, although it's a different kind of intensity than you get with, say, rice or millet. Those are the staple crops that underwrite the civilizations that come to develop in, the Fertile Crescent, in Egypt, in China, in India. That these crops allow for the density of population. So a few important notes here. I think we're all familiar with that story, but I think a few important notes here is that at this point, sophisticated tool use, art in general, has been around for 30, 40, 50,000 years, again, depending on where you set all these dates. And so the sophisticated use of tools and of art has been around for tens of millennia, tens of thousands of years before you get the explosion of the agricultural revolution. And so it's important to ponder, what happened, what's going on for all those years that we don't get that. And then why all of a sudden, sudden relatively speaking, but this evolution into this new form of civilization founded on, these cereal crops. And part of the explanation is that it was a on again, off again. Like the agricultural revolution is not one thing, it's many things. And if you look in the archaeological record, what you find is that larger scale cultures were able to exist with herding and following the herds, with fishing. A lot of the history of fishing has been lost or is only now being rediscovered because sea level rise. The oceans are very much higher than they were 10,000 years ago. And so that meant that any large coastal settlements, we don't know how large, but there's evidence that they might have been quite sophisticated and quite large, are just buried, right? Well, they're buried. They're underwater and significantly underwater, not a few feet, but a lot of underwater. And so a lot of the history, the archaeological record along the coast has been lost to that sea level rise. But what is left to us all over the world, this is not just in the New World, not just in the Eurasian area or in Europe, but all over the world, is the archaeological evidence that all sorts of mixed steps were taken so that, seasonally people would gather around maybe seed crops that were more productive in one area naturally. They would gather those, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people would be there for a while and they'd go away. Cultivation of lakefront areas became more intense and then faded away in some areas, like sort of intense Mexico area, all over the world. But there's good records from Mexico where they did this they used lake water or lake soil to cultivate really dense garden crops, vegetable crops, and were able to sustain large population groups with that. That also seems to have faded away at times. And so it wasn't like this one-off discovery. What happened is aspects of agriculture and of increased density of population was discovered over and over again, experimented with, grew, died out, changed, transformed. And so it was this ongoing multi-layered, multi-level process. And then at some point, and for some reason, exactly why, it really took off in, the Fertile Crescent, in Egypt, in China, and then later, a little bit later, archaeologically speaking, in the New World, of course, unconnected there probably. So some people suggest it was climate change, might have been other things. It's hard to know, but what's important, or I think another aspect that is important here, is to recognize what had to change. Exactly how and when and why is hard to track down, but what did have to change and what did change over this, tens of thousands of years that allowed for the agricultural revolution is, again, it's not the physical things, although those are necessary. The tool use is super helpful and necessary. The communication and art probably necessary for this. But notice the revolution, which is what I'm really fascinated by, is the revolution of the mental aspects here. So to move from a functionally primate, small group, small area, mostly natural, like a kind of hunter-gatherer or fruit-gathering, harvesting sort of community into an agrarian community is this massive transformation. Again, it happens in steps over time, but what ends up happening in this transformation of the outlook and the mental capacity and the understanding, or at least the imagination of the world that's involved. So, for instance, your time frame has to expand dramatically. So you're not worried about tomorrow or the next day or the next week or the next month. You don't even have, it has to extend even beyond a sense of seasons, because you're planting sometimes crops today that will not be mature and be able to be harvested for 6 months. And lots of things have to happen over those 6 months to make it so that you're likely to get that crop that is harvestable. And then you have to eat for those 6 months, which means you have to have some theory, some concept, some outlook that allows you to store the crops that are harvested in 6 months or in 3 months or 4 months or whatever the period is. Store that and then save it over the next year so that you can repeat this process. And then, which is very clear, is these societies quickly learned, or had already known, to sort of, again, it's this overlapping process. It's not like one day they got up and knew this through experiences that, we don't need to just save enough food for next year. We need to save enough food for a couple of years, or at least 2 years, in case we get a really bad harvest, right? If we get a bad harvest and everybody starves, that's bad. So we need to try and save some food, not just for next year, but for the following year. Let's just say that, just as simple as that. Now, in some areas like the Mesopotamia, they had multiple crops a year, so maybe their time frame was a little shorter originally, but then it expands out. Egypt was more seasonal in that sense, more of a year or twice a year crops. China with rice harvesting, you could do multiple times, but you get the notion here is the cyclicality of time becomes dramatically expanded. So that you have somebody, and basically kind of everybody who's participating in this process has to have this greater sense of, oh, hey, if I do this today, not just tomorrow, but in a year I'll have food, and maybe in 2 years I'll have food. So this is mind-blowing expansion of time horizon. So this isn't a small expansion of time horizon. This is a massive expansion of time horizon, and it's abstracted. So the monkeys, the chimps, are primate ancestors. Again, they do have this because, like, the reason they're able to have a sense of friendship is because they're able to remember the past and they're able to project into the future, and they're cultivating very directly with the same chimps, right? They're their same bonobos who are in their tribes, like the same group that is with them. But that level is now extended beyond other chimps, beyond other bonobos, beyond other, primates that we're with, into the natural world and into this abstract sense that crops that haven't even been planted yet, I'm imagining will be there in the future if I do these things. So I'm not harvesting fruit I see. I'm not remembering that the fruit shows up on some periodic basis on those trees, so I should go back and visit them again. I'm imagining that if I plant a seed, it will produce something in a very distant future, and that even beyond that, if I then store that seed, potentially then I'll have food for even a longer time frame. And so food becomes divorced from now, because food becomes basically a stored product of the past, right? Like, because you're not eating what you're harvesting, you're eating what has been stored from past harvests, and so your eating becomes disassociated from like present activity. So present activity, which again, notice that when primate societies, hunter-gatherer societies, there's the very direct correlation between the activity I do and food, right? Like, so it's not, doesn't take a huge imaginative leap. It takes some, by the way, for like certain types of hunting, you have to, planning and all this. So again, it's an evolutionary process. But when you move to a full cereal-based, which again, complicated steps, takes a long time, there's many different versions of it, but by the time you get there, you are literally eating the past, right? Your food comes to you from a memory of activities of multiple people, by the way, not just you, from the past. And the work you're doing now is being projected into the future. So the lived process of the human in a cereal-based society has this just remarkably different time perspective and sense of the world perspective, because it's almost, because this, we'll talk about the rise of religion later, but you can see it here, right? It is almost the rise of a faith-based, although you do have experience with it, you have seen it work, so you do know that it is possible, but you are doing things where you're saying, if I do it today, in 6 months, I'll have a return. And for now, I'm living on that return from 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 2 years ago, potentially, depending on how long it's been stored. So you have that, like, just phenomenal transformation and sort of one level of abstraction between activity and food, like of that really basic nature. Another aspect of this that goes along that makes it even further out is you see this in China in particular, but also in basically everywhere you have cereal crop agriculture. China is just the craziest example, is the level of irrigation projects that they undertook. All the soil improvements, irrigation, all of this to try to control water, because of course this is going to become crucial. The more water control you have, the more land becomes arable, the better your crops, right? And all good things flow from this. Requires, again, yet another level, even a deeper level, because now we have people who are digging, canals, channels, ditches that project might be generating water flows that benefit people that I've never even met down there someplace. And so I know that if I dig this, I'll get some rice today, and that this water is flowing someplace where those people are going to grow rice. And the payback time on this intensive agricultural work and irrigation work and draining land to make it arable and building up dikes and all of this projects that are, Egypt, you see it everywhere when this cereal revolution takes place, right, it is even a longer throw. So probably not just a regular person on the ground working in the field or working on these ditches. They weren't in the planning stages of this probably, but at some level somebody was. And they're sitting there going, oh, look, in 5 years, if we do this today, over the next 5 years, this will be good. Over the next 10 years, this will be good. And so one of the things you see develop almost invariably with the rise of cereal agriculture is calendars. Because wanting to know when you are, so that you know when you're supposed to do, do we plant today? Do we plant tomorrow? Do we plant yesterday? We got to get it right, because we got to know when the rains are going to fall. We got to know when the sun's going to shine to ripen the crops, and we got to get them in before the weather turns again. And how we keep track of that and how we know and how we plan causes now you're getting calendars, again, famously in Mesoamerica, where they're doing whatever, 30,000 year cycles or 6,000 year cycles, right? They're doing these crazy long time frames. Is wow, this is just an absolute intellectual explosion, revolution. It opens up this space, or it applies space that had been opened up in the human imagination that could begin to reconceptualize the world on these much, much vaster timescales than we had ever been able to do before, or had the opportunity or need perhaps to express it, whether it was the need that agriculture had for this kind of planning that required the expansion of the mind, or if the expansion of the mind co-evolved with the agricultural revolution, so that as we extended the time frames, so our imaginations were able to solve these problems. Somehow that feedback loop produced the kinds of minds we have today that can imagine projects on the 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 100,000 year time frame. We can whether we do it or not, that's not the important thing, is that we can imagine it. That now our mental outlook has been just blown out in time. Wow, it is much, much vaster. Our world, it becomes a much longer periodicity, and then calendars and timekeeping become an obsession with. Basically, civilizations become obsessed with this for the obvious reasons. Is that if you plant your crops at the wrong time, everybody starves to death. So that's bad, and it's an imperfect science, of course. And so they're struggling and working hard and making sacrifices and doing all the things you do to try and control the weather and interact successfully with it. But most importantly, for the outlook that I'm trying to explore here, is how that mental transformation is expressed in and probably necessary for the development of agriculture. And that includes this just radical expansion of a sense of time. There in the primates, again, it's there in the primates. They have a version of it, but it just gets, it's a just huge multiple of expansion of that. And we live with it today, and we take it for granted as if it's natural. And it's natural for us. It feels natural to have this very long time frame and to be able to think about the world in those terms. but it is an outcome of this coevolution of our mental conditions and our mental capacities within an environment that asks for us to have that, and that we just take it for granted. It makes sense. I guess it's normal, but I think we forget, and this is what I'm trying to remember in this series, is all those things that we forget. We forget that this is not necessarily so, that these time horizons that we take for granted. So when a student says, oh, I'm going to go to college for 4 years or 6 years, and I'm going to get a degree that's going to help pay off in the future, that is seed planting, right? This is just that's just like, oh, I can plant a seed today, and in 6 months I'll be able to get some food, and I'll be able to store that food for another 6 months, and so all of that will be good. Being able to throw our minds out in those time horizons allows us to do things that just would be impossible. And again, we just take it for granted. We just assume this is the way people are. It seems to be a mix of civilization, culture, nurture, nature, all of it mixing together to create minds that just take this for granted. Saving for retirement as I get older. It's like, oh yeah, I've been, they take money from my check every month for my whole life. And then all of a sudden, you get close and you go, oh, well, maybe that was a good idea. I mean, these retirement savings accounts are like on 30, 40 year time frames. That's crazy to have an imagination and to have a culture and civilizations that allow you to just elaborate a vision across decades like that, across most of your life, is extraordinary. And then, of course, you get to the point where you're building cathedrals like in France or other pyramids that take generations and generations and generations. And so people can happily work away on projects that are going to take vastly longer than their lifespans, multiple lifespans. And this doesn't bother them because they can still imagine an outcome. This is just extraordinary. But again, we take it for granted, which perhaps we should, but I like to highlight that. As we'll see, this becomes important for our condition today. And then not just time, but space, of course. Now, space becomes very different. Like all of a sudden, we're reconceptualizing our relationship to the spaces we inhabit, the earth itself, for a number of reasons, not the least of which is planting is a very complicated problem. And in fact, recent archaeological, I guess it wouldn't be archaeology because it's writing, so the historical studies of Babylonian mathematics has discovered that they had sort of come up with a quasi-solution to quadratic equations because they were trying to plant crops in curved and constantly changing fields. And so you need sort of sophisticated or somewhat sophisticated mathematics to be able to solve these problems. And it's a core problem. Like one of the things you get is geometry. Why do you get geometry? Because if I'm going to plant a cereal crop, I need to know how many seeds to plant per area, whatever my area is, acre, hectare, cubit. Like the unit doesn't matter. It's the fact that I need to know how many units I have and how much grain, because notice that's grain I can't eat. So I have to store some grain to eat, and I have to store some grain to plant. I need to know how much of each I have, how much to store, and also I need units of cubical volume. Think about that. What a bizarre thing to need. I need to understand space cubically. Because I got to store it, and I need to know how much is in there and how many units I have of something, and then how many units we need to eat to keep people rolling. How many units do I need to replant? That's the crucial one. Eating is good. Replanting is even better because otherwise nobody eats, and we all understand this. And so I have to have the surface area that I'm trying to plant. I need to know how that translates from a two-dimensional unit into a three-dimensional storage volume. And this gets really complicated very quickly, as you can imagine, right? You're like, oh, God, how do we know? Like, how do we? And rough rules of thumb are okay. But the larger your civilization becomes, the more dependent you become on seed crops. And by the way, of course, they weren't 100% dependent on seed crops. They're still they're still growing vegetables. They're still hunting. They're still herding. They're still gathering stuff from the sea, varying depending on where they are and in their environment. But when you're, 50, 60, 70, 80% of your calories become dependent on a limited number or, terrifyingly enough, one seed crop, well, now you can't make big errors. Big errors equal big death, and big death is bad. And so you're just very concentrated on trying to solve this. And so we begin to reconceptualize our concept of space. I mean, yeah, space. So we did time. Yeah, reconceptualize our concepts of space. And so you get this just press for math. I mean, what it works out to be is like, we got to do some math problems and we need to do them now. And so there's any number of ways to approach this. There's not one way to solve these problems. You can come up with shared physical units like a stick or a rope that everybody uses that. And then you have like rules for like, lay it down 5 times or, lay it, count how many times you lay it and then, then fold it in half and lay it the other way. It had all these bizarre systems that they look bizarre to us, but if they work, they're not bizarre. But the ability to now imagine space in this way starts to put it under control, under management, as it were. And now you also start to have this notion of ownership or controlled area. Because if I plant an area, I damn well want to be able to make sure I get to harvest that area. And so we're going to start marking things out. We're marking them out because we need to know how big the areas are for planting, but also because it's mine. And that territorial element that is, again, there in our early primate ancestors now just gets, in the archaeological record, you start getting territorial markers and field markers just explode in the archaeological record because, this is King Bob's fields. All these fields are King Bob's, or these are all the fields of Duke whoever, right? Whatever the local process is. What you're seeing is this just dramatic transformation in how we relate to the natural world, just in the sense of having a sense of space. Like, this is our territory, and then there's the rest of the universe, which is kind of like the primate model, and the rest of the universe being probably relatively vague, like just stuff out there. All of a sudden it becomes, no, this field right here is mine. The neighboring field maybe is somebody else's. We're all together because we're all under King Bob's fields, right? Like there's not one way, of course, to organize this, but so both your time horizon and your space horizon get completely reorganized and expanded and complicated. And this begins to drive a transformation in social hierarchy, of course, which, again, a lot of people have criticized. They said, when we move from somewhat hierarchical like chimp society, although, we're as closely related to bonobos, who are much flatter than chimp society, but even chimp society is not that hierarchical, to like with kings or pharaohs or whatever, these, very, lots of slaves, lots of pyramid. But it is that does is true. Like, I don't want to say that, but it does tend to obscure that there's a lot of different ways that these societies were organized. Some of them were more small scale, much more communal, even large scale, seemingly top down, like with pharaohs and such. It's be careful, right? I guess when you think about this, because it's easy to forget that despite the top-down, the some people giving orders and looks like a lot of slaves in a lot of these cultures, it's still fundamentally a cooperative endeavor. If everybody doesn't work together, you're not going to get the results. Things are going to be bad. And so it's pretty clear that a lot of these societies, it's easy to look at the Egyptian one and go, ooh, very hierarchical, but even there, you had the pharaoh at the top, you had some elite, particularly the scribal elites and the priests, and then it seemed to be a whole bunch of people all just hanging out doing agriculture. And there were slaves, but there seems to be a lot of people that weren't just slaves, and what it means to be a slave in different societies and so on and so forth. So it's, there's just any number of ways that this ramifies out in cereal agriculture. But the communal cooperative nature is absolutely fundamental, even when it looks it can be very exploitative and hierarchical. It is still, when you compare it to other ways of doing this is a communal endeavor. Maybe not be a healthy commune, and yet, so that ability for people to come together and to look at each other and say, yes, I'm going to work in this big field, and I'm working for me, but I'm also working for this greater society, right? We're doing these greater endeavors, and it seems pretty clear this is why you get monumental architecture. In fact, monumental architecture seems to predate cereal crop civilization. And the archaeological speculation now is that when you got excess, either a herding excess or a fishing excess or a temporary, like you were doing like lakeside garden farming, and you'd get these big excesses of food, you could bring a lot of people together. And what you did when you brought a lot of people together for some reason is you thought, let's build big things out of stone. Like, I don't know, but apparently this is just a human impulse. Let's build big things out of stone. So you find it all over the world. It's not one society that does this. It's everywhere. And you go, oh, if we have the resources, what we like to do, or seems to be communally, is invest our time and energy in something that we do together that makes us feel, as if we have a shared project. And, that outlook, that mindset, it just is there in the archaeological record. Again, it's hard to know exactly why they did it, but it's so consistent and so everywhere. Even, again, predates even agriculture, but when you get the cereal-based agriculture, it's hard to find large-scale cereal-based agricultural societies that didn't do monumental architecture. You find it in the New World, in Aztecs, Incas, Mayas. You find it in, the Harappan civilization. You find it in India. You find it in Angkor Wat. You find it in Egypt, of course. You find it in the Fertile Crescent everywhere. I mean, it's just wow. What's the big one? The huge mounds in Eastern Europe. I forget now, but there's so many of them, right? And it's such a consistent. And the more archaeology we do, the more we find. And so again, this suggests that we really do have this foundational and probably necessarily foundational communal sense. And that big projects like agriculture or like building a stone something or a pyramid makes what we used to share in tribal groups of 20 or 30 or 40, and somehow with our new imagination, our new expansion of time and space, allows us to then, make that abstraction and live in that abstraction and inhabit a world in which we go, yes, we now aren't 30 primates who I know personally for my whole life. We are now thousands or tens of thousands, most of whom I don't know, but I know we did, Stonehenge, or we did something together. And that's what matters. And that somehow gives meaning to the endeavors that we continue to do that allow these civilizations to grow and expand and prosper. Or, if not, they fail and they vanish, which has also happened again. By the way, many of these early cereal societies got to fairly good skies, thousands, tens of thousands, and then, with climate change, internal problems, whatever, and then they died out. So again, discovering cereal crops was not a guarantee that, okay, now you've solved the problem and you just expand and win. It means maybe it works for a while and then maybe it doesn't. So what does all this add up to, and why is this so important? I think it's obvious of why it's so important on one level, right? Because if you don't have the food base, then you can't have large concentrations of individuals to sustain. And so when you get the large concentrations of individuals, then you get all the things we've talked about. I'm going to do one on cities, which of course follows on closely here, and how, you get social hierarchy and division of labor and, specialization, and it's all great. And we're off and rolling. But underwriting all of this, making all of this possible is this just transformation in the imagination. This is why I think art is so important, is that we can imagine a future in which, hey, if we select these seeds and plant them, maybe we'll get better wheat crop. And it's clear that they did this for generations to produce the more productive wheat that allowed for the expansion. These are not natural crops that they're planting. It is the selection and purposeful breeding of seed that allows for the improved crops, that allows for the expanded population base, which allows for more research and more improvement, right? And so then that flywheel gets going. Imagination reconceptualization of the world, articulation of your place within a historical context, because now you have to have a past that looks back on, years of harvest, if not generations of harvest, and imagines a future of years of harvest and even generations of harvest, and what improvement would mean and how it could be planned. Because when you go to dig a large canal project with lots of ditches off to, you're imagining a future that's built on things that you've experienced in the past, and you're making it real in the world today. And this whole articulation of this vision is, it transforms the world. I mean, it has utterly and completely transformed the world that we live in, for good and ill, right? So we can talk about whether this is a good idea, but it is definitely an idea that took off. And wow, and we live in it today so powerfully. But so much of what people talk about today as being human capacities gets expressed and developed and reinforced when your vision of time has to be so much longer, and your imagination of the complexity of the world and of the space in which you inhabit and your identity within that space just gets transformed. But a very important safety note here, there's so many of them, but one that I really want to reinforce here as we exit is probably, and this is, again, a hard number to pin down. I tried to research this several different ways, but give or take, and I'd be willing to go a couple of 100 years, maybe longer, in any direction, either direction. It was likely not until about 500 AD that even half the world's population lived in the seed crop civilizations. So not that long ago, just over 1,000 years, 1,500 years ago, and even 1,000 years ago, much of the world's population was primarily involved in not seed crop agriculture. Now, this doesn't mean hunting, gathering. That's one thing it can mean, but it can also mean, fishing. It can mean herding. There's any number of ways. Mixed market gardening. This sort of, like a lot of Central Africa had all kinds of, still today has these sorts of, gourd growing and cassava growing and sort of mixed crops based on that. And they don't have the kind of civilization that we think of when we think of basically cereal crop agriculture, although you have potatoes and maize and stuff in the New World. Same concept. And so one of the weird things that happens in our world is there are fissures between different traditions of civilization. When you look at when you look at early Islamic texts, or the Quran in specific, but early Islamic texts and rules and ethos, it's clear a lot of that came from a civilization that was based on herding and nomadic tendencies were more emphasized than a settled agrarian culture. And that's a big difference in outlook and experience and imagination of the world. And so even today, we still have these tensions between the cereal crop civilizations and outlooks and other types of societies. Because again, it's only fairly recently that even half the world's population was primarily seed crop based. And again, even when you are primarily seed crop based, it doesn't mean you aren't still doing seasonal hunting. I mean, even today, people fish and food. In France, people have market gardens, right? They're supplementing their diet with crops that they grow themselves. And so that tradition of some self-sustaining, primarily, seed crop, cereal crop, civilization-based food, even in developed countries, is still there. It still lives. People still have that imagination of, oh, wouldn't it be great to have that self-sustaining garden, or to get a lot of our food from our garden? It's like, yes, that is true, and I believe in it. I have a garden. I like to get food from my garden. But I basically think this is just an unbroken chain of memory and experience from our past of going, yeah, it's great to rely on the grocery store or the duke or the king or the pharaoh for our seed crops and get it from the priests once a year, whatever, how that works. But it's also great to have a little patch that you cultivate yourself. And so even today we have that memory. We still live that recollection of a not reliant on the seed crop in whatever manifestation it has. But, we're doing a little hunting, we're doing a little fishing, we're doing a little market gardening. We're still going to maintain that tradition, even though we live in a world that's had cereal crop agriculture for 8,000 years, right? We're still going to continue that, in part because we really haven't had it for 8,000 years. Most of us have only had it for maybe 1,000 years or 1,500 years. And even then, it's always been mixed. And so it's easy to overemphasize how it's like, oh, once you get civilization, it's as if all of a sudden everybody in the world lives this way. No. And some of the tensions and conflicts and philosophical strife that you see today, I think it grows in part from the divergent worldview from those who took the seed crop outlook as their predominant view, and those who still have not, who have still been pursuing other concepts, other virtues. And you can see this in even medieval European history, where hunting was an absolutely crucial aspect of the aristocratic worldview, the nobility, their outlook. Why? I don't see this discussed so much, but I would argue that it's pretty clear that it embodies a set of values that are different from those required for primarily cereal crop agriculture. And they wanted to maintain those values because they thought they were superior. They thought they were better than those that are basically being imposed and made necessary by the social structures and civilizations that were primarily based on the cereal crop agriculture. So all through Europe, particularly Northern Europe, right, there was this long transition period, and other values and other concepts and other outlooks continued to fight against the sort of ideas that you get when you encounter cereal crops. And when you start to move towards your primary food source being these kind of long-term, multi-generation, agrarian, aqueduct systems, like all the stuff that you have to have in order to make it possible to build a civilization on these crops. It's not one thing that happens. It's this whole cultural shift. And I'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the city aspect of this agrarian revolution. But it's not done. It's not a finished thing. We're still working on this revolution. We still resist it. And different values are still at play in the world, and fight back against this and try to question it. And yet it is and has been the predominant source for much of the world for about a millennia. And the exceptions matter, of which there are many, as I mentioned, but for about a millennia, we've been living with the agrarian revolution as the primary driver. And then the last development, the most recent development, I would say, or one of the most recent significant developments, when you get to the Industrial Revolution. So now we're just going back, 150 years, again, wherever you want to set that, knock yourself out, where you transition from a world in which 60, 70, 80% of your population is involved in agriculture to, in the United States or France today, you're talking about 1%, 2%, 3% of your population, 4% at most in most developed countries, maybe 5%, which is to say very easy, 90 to 97% of your population has nothing to do with agriculture. And one of the things that happens is, so that whole outlook, that whole mode of life, that entire system that is developed and built up over, again, millennia, starts to dissolve, starts to break down. Those habits of mind, those habits of behavior, that the social fabric that's built up around that just starts to unravel, and something else has to be made new from that. And I think one of the transitions we're really going through in the contemporary world today is people talk about, the Industrial Revolution, and they talk about the technological revolution, all of which are real. I don't want to, say these do not exist or aren't hugely impactful. But I think part of the impact that is missed is they say, we did the agricultural revolution, and then we did the Industrial Revolution, then we technological revolution. But it's when you do the Industrial Revolution and you begin to unweave the fabric of societies that had existed for a millennia or 2 millennia or 3 millennia or more, right? The Industrial Revolution wasn't just something new. It was an undoing and a rewriting of something that was very, very old. And we're only about 150-ish, 200 years, probably on the outside, into the Industrial Revolution. And so something that took several millennia to build up is being undone. And then we start doing another technological revolution that starts undoing the patterns of the Industrial Revolution. It's like, wow, one of the things that may be happening in the modern world is that's just too much too fast, right? We're unweaving faster than we can weave. I really do think this is a very real possibility, that we really haven't overcome the agricultural revolution yet. And notice schools all over the world tend to run on the agricultural calendar, even though almost no one in most countries has anything to do with agriculture. Now, if you're in a country that still is very agrarian based, that makes total sense. Let the kids out for the spring harvest. Let them work in the summertime. That's totally reasonable. Do your school that way. But when you're in the United States, basically no one works on a farm, right? So why, statistically, there are no farms in the United States. So why have a school year based on this? Oh, because agriculture, because we got good at it, and we have been doing it as civilizations, not as individuals, of course, but as civilizations for, a few thousand years. And then when you're the inheritor of a few thousand-year tradition, this is what you do. Our calendars are built this way. It's not, why are our calendars organized the way they are? It's because of agriculture, right? It wasn't an abstract experiment. I mean, they are abstract, of course, but it was an abstraction built on the need to plant crops and to know when to plant them. And it still functionally shapes the way we think about our year. Even though, again, basically almost no one has anything to do with agriculture anymore, right? Like that. So those transformations that take place over millennia don't go away overnight. You can layer as many new revolutions on top as you want. We're still primates who have discovered agriculture. We can only adapt so quickly to new environments. We can only rewrite new systems and reweave new social orders so quickly. And so it took, again, 30 to 50,000 years after the explosion of tool use, really sophisticated, really impressive tool use and art, beads, tattooing, painting, everything, the whole deal, before you start to really have agriculture take hold. So it was a slow transition, slow development. And even then, it took another probably 10,000 years before half the world's population had adopted this outlook, these mind frames, these time horizons, this sense of the universe, if you will. And then follow that on to the transition from the Industrial Revolution at most 200 years ago. And obviously, I think if you think about it, even for a second, I just give a few off the top of my head, the school year, the way our calendars are built, the way we think about seasons, our holidays, many of our holidays are built around an agricultural society in which we don't participate that way. And yet it still shapes our worldview and our outlook and how we think about it. Bread, particularly one of the things you'll notice if you're in France, and I think much of Europe, Spain, there's a great phrase in Spain, which I can't repeat in Spanish, but there's nothing longer than a day without bread. And you go, wow, bread. It goes Roman age, bread in circuses, right? Although bread probably then meant something like mush. But anyway, that idea like, oh, bread is good because bread is life. Bread is everything. Like just that concept, all of the resonance and the emotional attachment and the romanticism around baking and bread. This is from a cereal crop civilization. If you're not a cereal crop civilization, you don't care that much, right? Like this is just like, I don't know, why are these people all about bread? I don't get it. Like we like rice, like we're all about the rice. If you're not doing wheat, then the bread is just not that significant. So when the primates discover agriculture, it takes a long time. For as far as we can tell, we had all the necessary capacity to do agriculture, 30, 40,000, 50,000 years ago. No problem. But it took this slow evolution, probably cultural, probably intellectual, and outlook, plus to develop the seeds and all this before we could make the leap, if you will, but probably slow evolving steps towards civilizations and large cities built on these crops. And that did not require just the sort of technological or food breakthrough. It required a psychological, sociological, cultural, mental, imaginative breakthrough that transforms how we view the world. And functionally, if you want to know how you view the world today, unless you're from a different society that is not the inheritor of one of these civilizations, and which still exists, by the way, lots of people out there still live this way, then this is your mindset. This is your outlook. This is where it came from. And as much as we've had an industrial revolution, as much as we're going through a technological revolution, communications, data revolution, wherever you want to think about it, we're still the children of that social and mental transformation that took place thousands of years ago and was itself an expression of the inherent capacities that were there in our primate ancestors. So, the primates discover agriculture. Thank you very much.